days of creation, or phases of creation, are not 24-hour periods. The scriptures, in stating, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth," leave matters indefinite as to time. This use of the term beginning is therefore unassailable. Regardless of the age scientists may seek to attach to the earthly globe and to the various planets and other heavenly bodies. The actual time of the creation of the material heavens and the earth may have been billions of years ago. Therefore, according to the Big Bang Theory, there were 13.7 billion years for the expansion and formation of all the stars and galaxies, planets, etc. According to the Columbia history of the world, our galaxy is about 10 billion and our solar system about 5 billion years old. The history of each and every continent goes back to the early beginnings of the planet Earth itself, around 4.5 billion years ago. All this happened in one small sentence of the very first verse of the Bible, a distinct event even before the first days of creation, the phases of which focus simply on the conditions to the formation of life on earth. The Hebrew word for day is yom. It can mean different lengths of time. It is used for time in general, for a long period of time, a season, or for an extraordinary event in time. Likewise, an evening and morning is comparative to the metaphoric use of dawn and twilight. Therefore, a day is not limited to 24 hours. That a day can be longer than 24 hours is indicated by Genesis chapter 2 verse 4, which speaks of all the creative days as one day. Also indicative of this is Peter's inspired observation that one day is with Jehovah as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as one day, which is in reference to Psalms 90 verse 4. Ascribing not just 24 hours, but a longer period of time, thousands of years, to each of the creative days better harmonizes with the evidence found in the earth itself. Although the Bible does not specify the duration of each of the creative periods, yet all 6 of them have ended, it being with respect to the 6th day, as in the case of each of the preceding 5 days. And there came to be evening, and there came to be morning, a 6th day. However, this statement is not made in regards to the 7th day, on which God proceeded to rest, indicating that it continued. Also, more than 4,000 years after the 7th day, or God's rest day, commenced, Paul indicated that it was still in progress. At Hebrews chapter 4, verse 1 to 11, he, Paul, referred to the earlier words of David in Psalms 95, verse 7, 8, and 11, and to Genesis chapter 2, verse 2, and urged, "Let us therefore do our utmost to enter into that rest." By the apostles' time, the 7th day had been continuing for thousands of years and had not yet ended. The 1,000-year reign of the Messiah Emmanuel, who is scripturally identified as the Lord of the Sabbath, is evidently part of the great Sabbath, God's rest day. This would indicate the passing of at least 7,000 years from the commencement of God's rest day to its end. The week of days set forth at Genesis chapter 1 verse 3 to chapter 2 verse 3, the last of which is a Sabbath, seems to parallel the week into which the Israelites divided their time, observing a Sabbath on the 7th day thereof, in keeping with the divine will. And since the 7th day has been continuing for thousands of years, it may reasonably be concluded that each of the 6 creative periods or days were at least 7,000 years in length. Therefore, the word phase seems to be an appropriate substitute for the word day. It's a particular appearance or state in a regularly reoccurring cycle of changes. It is a distinguishable part in a course, development, or cycle. Now the earth proved to be formless and void, and there was darkness upon the surface of the watery deep, and God's active force was moving to and fro over the surface of the waters. The primitive earth is usually thought of as a burning landscape of lava and volcanoes. However, this verse in Genesis clearly states that the earth was a watery, formless, landless surface covered in darkness. The primitive earth was a global sea of water. It had no moon as yet, and the sun did not shine. This is a different model of cosmology for the formation of the solar system. Therefore, on the first day, phase, and God proceeded to say, "Let light come to be." Then there came to be light. After that, God saw that the light was good, and God brought about a division between the light and the darkness. And God began calling the light day, but the darkness he called night. The primitive planets orbiting within stellar dust clouds around the embryonic core of a dark star, the sun was born. This gave birth to our solar system. Now there was light to shine upon the earth, although only the few sunlight had filtered through the stellar dust clouds onto the surface of the watery deep. On the second day, phase, God went on to say, "Let an expanse come to be in between the waters, and let a dividing occur between the waters and the waters." Then God proceeded to make the expanse and to make a division between the waters that should be beneath the expanse and the waters that should be above the expanse. And it came to be so. And God began to call the expanse heaven. The early Archeozoic thin greenhouse atmosphere enshrouded the earth in a cloud of water vapor as it evaporates from the shallow sea. The primitive algae, seaweeds, played an important role in the history of Earth. The early planetary stage, the atmosphere was poisonous to animal life, but bacteria and plants thrive on carbon dioxide, which is a gas given off with the clouds of steam by volcanoes. The plants, for their part, produce oxygen as a waste product. In the early history of the planet, there was no oxygen, but gradually the plants produced enough of this byproduct so that an expanse in the atmosphere would separate the cloud vapor from the shallow sea. Thus, living organisms have given us our life-sustaining atmosphere. On the third day, or phase, and God went on to say, "Let the waters under the heavens be brought together into one place, and let the dry land appear." And it came to be so. And God began calling the dry land earth, but the bringing together of the waters he called seas. Further, God saw that it was good. And God went on to say, "Let the earth cause grass to shoot forth, vegetation bearing seed, fruit trees yielding fruit according to their kinds, the seeds of which is in it upon the earth." And it came to be so. And the earth began to put forth grass, vegetation bearing seed according to its kind, and trees yielding fruit, the seed of which is in it according to its kind. The dry land appeared in obedience to the command, the gravitative urge of some celestial visitor. This may have been the newly captured moon, or more probably some star, which may no longer be luminous, but which at that early date approached the earth from the south polar direction, and by its attraction caused the thin crust of superficial light rock material to gather together into a polar hemisphere of intensely folded and hence much strengthened Sile rock. And since the Sile sphere is an insignificant part of the whole, without essentially disturbing the position which the earth occupies in space. In the space thus stripped of its outer rock shell, The waters gathered to form the ocean, no longer a boundless sea, but one bounded by the borders of the sail cap that formed the land, and floored by the newly uncovered surface of the mantle. This land-bordered ocean now began the task of active erosion of the land and carrying the minerals to the sea, aided by the atmosphere and moon, which not only transmitted its motive force power to the waves and currents to assault its borders, but also carried vapor over the land, where it condensed into fog and water. This, gathered in streams and lakes, with the disintegrating effects of the air, helped considerably in rock destruction and the lowering of the lands. And now, too, the process of shoaling was aided by the activities of organisms, chiefly at first lowly plants, which began the segregation of lime salts from the water and the building up of reef structures on the shallow parts of the ocean floor and in protected coastal regions. The most advanced plants were the algae, the group that includes the seaweeds of today. Later differentiated genuses of algae invaded dry land. Club mosses and other primitive plants eventually became abundant, including arthropods. The diversity of land plants became greater in time. These plants grew to greater size, producing true forests with the help of insects dependent on the soil and vegetation. On the fourth day, or phase, and God went on to say, "Let luminaries come to be in the expanse of the heavens, to make a division between the day and the night, and they must serve as signs for seasons and for days and years, and they must serve as luminaries in the expanse of the heavens to shine upon the earth." And it came to be so. And God proceeded to make the two great luminaries, the greater luminary for dominating the day and the lesser luminary for dominating the night, and also the stars. Thus God put them in the expanse of the heavens to shine upon the earth, and to dominate by day and by night, and to make a division between the light and the darkness. Then God saw that it was good. Previously, on the first phase, the expression, "let light come to be," was used. The Hebrew word there used for light is or, meaning light in a general sense. But on the fourth phase, the Hebrew word changes to ma'or, which means the source of the light, rather than in a footnote on luminaries in the Emphasized Bible says in version 3, or light diffused. Then he goes on to show that the Hebrew word ma'or in verse 14 means something affording light. On the first phase, diffused light evidently penetrated the swaddling bands, but the sources of that light could not have been seen by an earthly observer because of the cloud layers still enveloping the earth. Now on this fourth phase, things apparently changed. An atmosphere initially rich in carbon dioxide may have caused an earth-wide hot climate, but the lush growth of vegetation during the third and fourth creative periods would absorb some of this heat-retaining blanket of carbon dioxide. The vegetation, in turn, would release oxygen, a requirement for animal life. On the fifth day, or phase, and God went on to say, "Let the waters swarm forth a swarm of living souls, and let the flying creatures fly over the earth upon the face of the expanse of the heavens." And God proceeded to create the great sea monsters and every living soul that moves about, which the waters swarmed forth according to their kinds, and every winged flying creature according to its kind. And God got to see that it was good. With that God blessed them, saying, "Be fruitful, and become many, and fill the waters in the sea basins, and let the flying creatures become many in the earth." On this phase, the seas flourished with marine vertebrates as fishes, reptiles, and birds, the reptiles including species that were capable of flying, while others were amphibious, all of which were either mammals or egg layers. On the sixth day, or phase, and God went on to say, "Let the earth put forth living souls according to their kinds, domestic animals and moving animal, and wild beasts of the earth according to its kind." And it came to be so. And God proceeded to make the wild beasts of the earth according to its kind, and the domestic animal according to its kind, and every moving animal of the ground according to its kind. And God got to see that it was good. We should note that the animal kingdom lived on earth many thousands of years before humans were created. However, they also coexisted, including the dinosaurs, with humans during the sixth creative phase. Now we come to the Synagogue Problem. In summary, the seventh day phase may have had a duration of at least 7,000 years since the creation of Adam. So if all 6 phases of creation were each at least 7,000 years in duration, that would make the beginning of God creating life on earth till now about 48,000 years so far, with 1,000 years pending for the millennial reign of the Messiah's return. This does not include the age of the earth itself, the sun, and the solar system that preceded the first phase in the beginning. So, the Archaeozoic, the Paleozoic, the Mesozoic, and the Cenozoic, all eras all occurred within the span of about 42,000 years. The problem is that the Cenozoic era begins with the last great ice age, or the great Jurassic transgression, or as I call it, the Noachian flood. There needs to be a readjustment of the geological record according to a catastrophist discipline. Amadeus Grabau has acceptable credentials as a scientist, but has drawn criticism and neglect for his theory and book on Earth geology of interpolation. He happened to have been of the old school of catastrophist Christian scientists who invoke aspects of divine intervention for the initial phase of geologic forces shaping the Earth's geology. This is unacceptable to modern geologists who are entirely uniformitarian. It seems necessary and appropriate to resurrect this old theory of Grabau because it most properly explains certain anomalies of how there can be a sustainable greenhouse world atmosphere. It is likewise reasonable to consider that with the expansion or inflation of Earth's mantle and crust during the pulsation period, the atmosphere would also expand and shrink in altitude. This will result in thinner layers of the atmosphere and allow a thin water canopy in the troposphere during the pulsation period. The resulting greenhouse effect will be diminished in its ability to trap heat to a degree that is detrimental to most living organisms. Most of the heat will escape by conduction with thin layers of cold air in the upper atmosphere. With a moderate global greenhouse, the increased biomass of vegetation covering the Earth would also absorb the heat by convection and with the absorption of water. So, during the pulsation period, as the Earth and seas expand from heat build up within the mantle, the atmosphere also expands and thins out and develops a thin water vapor canopy from the evaporation of water from the increasingly heated seafloor. It seems the transition to the present interpulsation period, the Earth contracted or shrank to a degree and intensity that the last one must have been abrupt and catastrophic. The water canopy would collapse and the atmosphere would greatly reduce in temperature, mimicking an ice age. The present interpulsation period had to have been the time of Noah's great flood. The Jurassic Age had a greater quantity of biomass on the land, sea, and air than which occurred any time before the Archaeozoic era. The transition to the interpolation period would be a more dramatic change than previous episodes. First chronological discrepancy in geology.
In the 1700s, Scottish geologist James Hutton and some of his contemporaries that the physical and chemical processes that shaped the Earth's surface provided clear evidence that the planet was at least tens of millions of years old. They based this estimate on a geologic principle known as uniformitarianism, which held that geologic processes in the past were essentially the same as those at work today. Hutton noted that the manner in which clay and silt were being deposited at the mouth of a river was observable by studying new layers of sediments and how they solidified into shale siltstone. He could infer how long it took the old layers to build up. By assuming that the same processes of sedimentation occurred over millions of years in the past, he could estimate the age of similar formations and hence the approximate age of the Earth. This method of using rock deposits as age indicators, however, depended on many variables that were too complex to measure. For example, climatic changes or differences in land elevation could both alter erosion rate.
Second chronological discrepancy in geology.
Neil Opdyke, who was then at Lamont, is a specialist in rock magnetism. He and his colleagues found that the magnetic signal was clearly marked in the cores they examined. Their discovery made it possible for the first time to correlate and date climatic events in any core that recorded the paleomagnetic reversal. However, what was still lacking was a relative timescale for Pleistocene events between magnetic reversals. Though globally synchronous, was not a precise absolute date. It is uncertain to a few tens of thousands of years. Even a firm date for the beginning of the Pleistocene epoch was unknown, because the appearance and disappearance of various fossil foraminifera are not necessarily synchronous in different parts of the world. There is still a considerable confusion in dating the beginning of the Pleistocene by this technique.
Third chronological discrepancy in geology.
However, researchers ran into a problem when dating sea cores. Instead of finding that the top layers dated from the present, they discovered that the first 10 centimeters, 4 inches, or so were typically 3,000 years old. As it turned out, the ocean floor, where these sediments are deposited, is the habitat for a number of bottom-dwelling animals. Crabs, octopi, clams, sea cucumbers, crustaceans, and worms are among those that forage there for food. In the process, these animals burrow, leave tracks and trails, and their excrement, and make holes and mounds in the sediment. While they are reworking the bottom ooze, these organisms are smearing out climatic evidence. Researchers have dubbed this process biotubation, a contraction of biological perturbation. Thus, the bottom dwellers mix sediments several centimeters deep, and thousands of years old, with freshly deposited layers. This mixing, known as a post-depositional process, gives the surface mud an average age of several thousand years and limits the time resolution of sea cores at all depths. Coevolution, page 57, 58.
In regards to all three previous discrepancies, it seems the Mesozoic era completely overlaps the Cenozoic era. Therefore, 42,000 years should be divided between only 3 geologic eras: Archaeozoic, 14,000 years; Paleozoic, 14,000 years; Mesozoic and Cenozoic combined, 14,000 years, till the time of post-flood civilizations. We should take notice. Nevertheless, Louis Agassiz inadvertently overthrew this rigid dogma in banishing the biblical deluge from the history of the earth. In its stead, there was now the Ice Age, and with the discovery of the Ice Age, a new era of geology and paleontological research began. In the book by Amadeus Grabau, The Rhythm of the Ages, chapter 23, The World in the Jurassic Age, it states, quote, to summarize the event, we may stress the fact of the wide transgression of the Jurassic Sea. This was probably the most extensive marine transgression known in the whole history of the earth. It was made possible by the great extent of the country, which had been peneplain during the long continental interval, for this provided extensive flat areas over which the sea could transgress, as it rose during the Jurassic period. Beginning at the several epices, the transgression filled the geosynclines, extended over the marginal platforms, and swept the country in one gigantic flood that spelled destruction to all animal and plant life in its path. It was the last great inundation. After its retreat, the Pangea became subject to the process of dismemberment, beginning with the opening of the South Atlantic between Africa and South America, widening as the later land block drifted westward. This increased, step by step, with increase in size of the Atlantic, until finally the arrangement of lands and seas that we are familiar with came into existence.
Now the last problem is the cause of the flood or ice age. The Jurassic flood was 1. Triggered by meteor composed primarily of ice, that has contributed significantly to raising sea levels drastically from an extraterrestrial source, according to abundant geological evidence. An asteroid roughly 10 kilometers, 6 miles, across. Asteroids hit Earth typically at high speeds of 10 to 20 km sec, 16 to 32 miles sec. The asteroid or comet that produced the Chicxulub crater was roughly 10 kilometers in diameter. When an object that size hits Earth's surface, it causes a tremendous shock wave while transferring energy and momentum to the ground, releasing an estimated 4,31023 joules of energy, equivalent to 191,793 gigatons of TNT. On impact, in addition, the shock of the impact produced magnitude 10 earthquakes, which were greater than the magnitude of any we have ever measured in modern times. The impact caused giant tsunamis in all directions. Debris from the explosion was thrown into the atmosphere, severely altering the climate, and leading to the extinction of roughly 3/4 of species that existed at the time, including the dinosaurs during the impact. The kinetic energy in the asteroid, or energy of motion, is converted to explosive energy, blowing debris of dust, soil, and rocks not only into the atmosphere, but out into space, where it fell back into the top of the atmosphere. Early calculations in the 1980s showed that so much dust entered the high atmosphere that the Earth was shrouded in a dust layer that blocked sunlight for several weeks or months. This would have killed some plants, disrupting the food chain. 2. However, it also had triggered the release of enormous subterranean sources of water under the Earth's crust. 3. That breaking open the springs of the vast watery deep was triggered by the meteor cracking open a volcanic fault line all around the Earth's crust, in the manner of the mid-Atlantic ridge. All the springs of the vast watery deep burst open and the floodgates of the heavens were opened. Genesis 7:11, 4. This crack in the crust later becomes a subduction zone. As the Earth shrinks up to releasing pressure from under the Earth's crust, the mantle being cooled off by the water as steam and gas, increasing atmospheric pressure. 5. This cataclysmic all happened for the duration of 1 year. Genesis 7:11, 8, 13. However, the adverse effects of such a dramatic climate change lingers indefinitely. Genesis 8:22. Thus specifically implying that the climate was not like that before the flood. 6. The meteor is likewise responsible for altering Earth's orbit around the Sun from a perfect 360 degree to a irregular 365.25 plus orbit. Although a perfect 360 degree orbit could possibly still be an elliptical orbit. 7. The inference at this point here is that a perfectly balanced climate existed in the world of Noah where evil people still enjoyed paradise conditions. Although the ground was cursed by Elohim for the sin of Adam, the flood completed the fulfillment of this curse. Genesis 3:17-19, 8. The implied inference here is Elohim saved mankind from self-annihilation, implied by Genesis 11:6. The point being, a favorable climate conditions B, and homogeneous culture C, corrupted human flesh and society by angelic sons of Elohim perverted the human gene, pull along with the interference of human development by introducing knowledge and technologies too advanced for socially primitive humans as to accelerating the pace of self-destruction similar to our own nuclear age. Thus Elohim was being merciful by intervening to destroy that world and to restrain the fallen angels that corrupted that world of Noah. 2 Peter 2:4. Jude verse 6. 9. The fallen angels were not motivated to leave their proper dwelling place in heaven simply by a desire to have sex with humans. What is implied by popular mystic subculture is the desire for the angels to be worshipped like gods by these humans. As such, if they take on the most attractive physical appearance, the women especially but also men alike will adore them as gods. The ancient Greeks are a good example of that. Therefore, it was Satan who tempted them, implied by Job 1:6-12 and Revelation 12:3-4-10. The population of humans prior to the flood may have already reached several billion souls, with a death rate that is slow by at least 300 years per human or at most 800 on average, with every man that has a child every 3 years by age 21 seems to reach an exponential rate by a factor of 100 or more. They were all distant relatives to Noah. Compassion was not a mindset of a barbaric world ruled by an eye for an eye and survival of the fittest. 11. With a very low sea level before the meteor introduced higher sea levels, there was indeed a land bridge of a supercontinent. Humans may have migrated to very distant parts of the earth, but, since humans have a natural tendency to inhabit areas very close to sea levels, most evidence of human remains, probably 90%, of that world is lost under present post-flood sea levels. 12. These scriptures imply that the people in Noah's world were warned by several hundred years in advance. Jude verse 13-14. Yes, the seventh one in line from Adam, Enoch, also prophesied about them when he said, "Look, Jehovah came with his holy myriads to execute judgment against all, and to convict all the ungodly concerning all their ungodly deeds that they did in an ungodly way, and concerning all the shocking things that ungodly sinners spoke against him." 2 Peter 2:4-5. Certainly God did not refrain from punishing the angels who sinned, but threw them into Tartarus, putting them in chains of dense darkness to be reserved for judgment. And he did not refrain from punishing an ancient world, but kept Noah, a preacher of righteousness, safe with 7 others when he brought a flood upon a world of ungodly people. 13. Also, when Elohim said, "His days will amount to 120 years, in Genesis 6:3 it is in reference to the time remaining before the flood event. Noah was 500 years old when he had his sons according to Genesis 5:32. He was 600 years old when the flood began. Therefore, Elohim would have told Noah 20 years before he had his sons on the 500th year of his life. That's 120 years. Therefore, how long does it take to build a boat? 14. As in most cases, only the patriarchs are named, not the women or any other sons. Thus it stands to reason that as likewise with Noah, he may have many other sons as well as daughters other than the 3 named sons of Noah. These are probably the only sons that remained loyal to their father, because in chapter 6, verse 18, it does not mention how many sons were to be saved with Noah. 15. Please understand with no uncertainty that the Nephilim of Genesis 6:4 are the bastard, mutant children of the fallen angels. Anyone who practices witchcraft would know that as a simple fact. They are the same men of fame as the heroes of Sumerian and Greek stories. If you read the story of Gilgamesh, and others like it, then you are reading about one of the Nephilim. These are demon-inspired stories of what transpired before the flood. These giants may not have survived the change of climate even if they had survived the flood. 16. If you see a map of the world destroyed by the Jurassic transgression, then you will see that many parts of the world were spared from utter destruction, namely some parts of China. 17. The descendants of Cain, who were exiled to the Far East, would have been in China. There are likewise small areas around the world where there would have been other survivors of the Great Flood. They will eventually converge on the plains of Mesopotamia. Genesis 11, 1, 2, 18. Lastly, the history of ancient China corroborates with the biblical flood with their own authentic recorded history completely independent of biblical association.